It's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. Welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. Joining me on the show today for the second time is Anthony Hill, who is a tiny houser living on the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. Anthony was on the show back in episode 13 with his partner Kira, sharing all about their tiny house journey and even some insights into relationships in small spaces. And I've invited Anthony back this time to chat about their experiences with using the Nature Loo 650 composting toilet. And in this conversation, we talk about the main reasons for choosing a composting toilet, how the Nature Loo 650 works, all about emptying, cleaning, smell and ventilation, the importance of understanding the microbiome and having a right relationship with nature. We also touched on some lessons from using a composting toilet, and Anthony shares some advice for tiny houses looking into which tiny toilet option is right for them, that could be you, and so much more. If you haven't listened to our previous show together with Anthony and Kira, I'll put a link in the show notes at tinyhouseconversations.com. And this year we're doing video podcasting for our guest interviews. So if you're a more visual person, you can also watch our full episodes at tinyhouseconversations.com/YouTube. You can also find Anthony at plasticpollutionsolutions.com.au. And Kira shares their tiny life on Instagram at Little Fig of the Hamptons. Again, all those links will be in the episode show notes. Before we dive in with Anthony, I just want to take a moment to pause and acknowledge that I'm recording this episode gathering here on Yuin Country. Anthony is on Bundjalung Country, and honouring the traditional custodians of these sacred lands, past, present and emerging, those that live among us, and just being really grateful to be able to park our tiny houses on these lands and to be able to be here and to treat these lands with respect and reverence. And so with that being said, and keeping that close to our hearts, onto this tiny house conversation with Anthony. Anthony, welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. It's so good to be here with you again today.
Hi, Lucy. Nice to be here with you too.
So, Anthony, this is your second time on Tiny House Conversations, and I know last time we had your partner Kira on, and we spoke all about your tiny house and the lifestyle that you're living up in the Northern Rivers and Bundjalung Country. I know that was around early 2022, and so a lot has happened in that time. I do have you on the show today to talk a bit about the composting toilet that you guys have been using for a while. But before we get into that, I would just love to hear a quick update from you, whatever you want to share about what's been happening. I think you've moved as well since the last time we were there, and floods happened and all of that. But anything you'd like to share about, what's been happening for you guys?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. The move actually happened a bit before our last interview, but we've definitely had some weather extremes, which I guess is happening around the world everywhere at the moment. But ours came in the form of floods, and not only the big floods of 2022, which impacted our area here, still actually, because there were so many landslides and road collapses that one road was only fixed a couple of months ago, which is the main road in and out of our village. Just mini ones everywhere, and then only since New Year's Eve, we've had two what you might call a mini flood as well, like extreme rainfall, and then the creeks and rivers coming up and us getting cut off. So I guess what we have started doing is, Kira and I are by no means what you might call preppers, but we have been prepping a bit because we have a dog and a cat, and we're kind of, worried that we might get cut off for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks, and we've got, no food, not only for ourselves, but for our little animals as well. So we're stocking up a lot more now than what we used to, and we have big containers. We've got big containers that we do keep things in, and I'd say that's pretty much the biggest change since you and I last spoke.
Yeah, it's a bit crazy this time, and I know what you mean about the prepper thing. I would say I'm not a full-on prepper too, but I have been doing those little things of like having more food stored away, having a generator and camping stove, and all these different things because at the moment, the world just feels I don't, who knows what's going to happen, and there are these different weather events that have been happening, and as we're sitting here and we're talking on video today, and I know we spoke about this offline before. You've updated your deck since last time, and you've kind of made it a more enclosed deck as well. Do you want to just share a little bit about that too, and yeah, the decision around that?
Yeah, well, having the big deck was always a big thing for me before I even had the tiny home, and just having a lot of outdoor space. And so that was amazing, but it was a very open deck, and so that leaves you vulnerable to, I guess, the weather as well. And up here, you have these rain periods that just go on and on and on. And we live in an area in a valley where there's this beautiful fog in the morning, especially during, there's probably 3 months of the year that we get really, really thick fog for several hours early in the morning. And I find it amazing because it's so peaceful, but then it makes everything wet, So
Yeah.
we were finding we come out in the morning and everything on the deck was wet. And then when we have very driving rain, that would come in and wet everything as well. So we ended up resolving to kind of enclose the deck. We wanted to do this by using as much secondhand or pre-loved material as we could, and we managed to source about 90% of it secondhand. And so corrugated iron and different windows online, beautiful antique stuff as well that we've just found online. And it's nice. We feel a bit more, I guess, protected from those weather things, but we can still open it all up and hear the birds and the insects and be as close to those nature sounds as we were before.
I feel like having a deck, I know for me, is like one of the best parts actually about living in a tiny home because then it no longer has to feel like a tiny home. Or you can, I think, as you guys have done, your deck is wider and larger than the actual space in your tiny home. So that that's amazing, and you can get to bring the outdoors in. And yeah, I love hearing the updates and the evolution as we were speaking again about offline. And just to switch gears here, because I mentioned before we were going to be talking about your composting toilet experiences, and you guys decided to go with a Nature Loo 650.
Mm.
And one of the most common questions that I get asked, as well as that I see in different tiny house Facebook groups, and I know that possibly you might get similar questions too. What's the deal with tiny house composting toilets? What brand? Does it smell? How does it work? And on and on and on. And so that's a big reason why I've wanted to get people on that are using the different systems, just to get a bit of an insight into how each system works, or maybe like helping people to make that decision of finding what might work for them in their situation. So just first up, I'd love if you're able to let us know what was the process, or what was the reason and intention behind choosing a composting toilet, say, versus a flushing toilet or an incinerating toilet or any other kind of option that's available for a tiny home.
We never really considered a flushing toilet because we did want to be as off-grid as possible, and we knew that we'd be using tank water. And tank water, I just mentioned the rainfall we get in the Northern Rivers. We also get droughts, and we have been through now 2 big droughts in the 6 years we've been in this tiny home, and we have to buy water. So we got to get this guy in with a big truck, and he brings town water. And I don't know if you're on tank water, but you can really tell a big difference between town water and tank water. It's often quite awful. It's a bit of a shock when you're suddenly drinking chlorinated, fluorinated water as opposed to your beautiful, fresh, clean rainwater. So there's that, and just you need water in general. So having a toilet where you're not flushing hundreds of liters of water a week needlessly was absolutely a given. There's no way we were going to do that. And so one of the other aspects was to choose, know that we were going to be living full time. Some people might have a tiny home that they might just go to on the weekends, and that might impact their choice as well. We knew we'd be full time, and so it'd be getting a lot of use. So having one of those composting toilets that has a tiny little cassette chamber underneath was not going to work. We'd have to change it every day or every second day. And we're very, very busy, both of us. So it was then having the split system and then getting the size which we considered would be about right for us. And the one we chose, well, we chose it, but we went to a place in Brisbane who have a lot of experience with composting toilets. And they said, for 2 people, this would be fine. You only need to empty it, say once every 4 to 6 weeks. And that's how it's been since then. So it was, there's a whole lot of other things. I don't know how deep you want to go into it, but also it's just another way of being in right relationship to the planet. I have a great connection with the ocean ever since I was a kid. I've spent a lot of time in the ocean and still do. And when I found out what humanity was doing with a lot of their waste, human waste, just pumping it out into the ocean, often untreated, but even if it's treated, it's full of chemicals. And we're then, it's heartbreaking to think that we are polluting the space of another creature, sort of thing. So I didn't want to be a part of that whole system either. So it's given us the opportunity to live our values as well.
I love how you talked about the water, and I completely agree. Those are 2 of some of the main reasons that I've also gone with a composting toilet. And in terms of the rainwater, I've got rainwater tank too, and I thankfully haven't had to get town water in, but there was a time a few months ago where I thought maybe that might have had to have been the case, was getting really low and it was really dry here. But I'm blown away at how much water you get to save when you're not flushing it away, multiple times a day. And then if you've got 2 people living in the space, double that, usually, or it's just, it's, and then when I go to someone else's house that has a flushing toilet, it's so strange. And I just go, wow, like it puts things into perspective. Don't you reckon? It's just,
it is. It's actually,
you don't realize.
It's a little bit of, if you think about humanity's insanity, the insanity of humanity, that rhymes, is that, especially in Australia, we live on the world's most driest inhabited continent, right? And we are flushing away water like if you talk about, there's 25 to 30 million people living in Australia, how many billions of litres we're just flushing away. Whereas if, I guess, something had have come in 20 or 30 years ago that, enabled composting toilets, then we would have saved a whole lot of that water over those years.
Exactly. And water is such a precious resource. I mean, there are people around the world that have very limited, if any, access to it, or it's very, difficult to source. So I know, for me, it's just something. This is how one of the ways that I'm going to play my part to, to not just flush away such a precious resource. And also the same thing as you mentioned before about the sewage. I think that's a really important thing too, because I'm assuming you've read the Humanure handbook, the Joseph Jenkins one, which I know is a bit of a Bible in the tiny house space. And when he was talking about some of the different ways that humans, the insanity that you're talking about, that we do things like with sewage, I'm just like, how did we even get here? How did we even think this was okay? And actually how much power we have to do things more in harmony with nature if we just have this reframe of taking responsibility for even this aspect of what we do and how we live, like managing our own organic matter. And I'm sometimes hesitant to talk about it as waste, like Anthony from Waterwell, he says it's not waste if you don't waste it. So I go, yeah, that's a fair point. And so and look, it's not convenient like our culture likes, and I think has conditioned to be for a very long time, and it's a lot more work. But as you say, it is having this deeper connection with the earth, the land, with just doing the right thing by the planet, and also just reducing that impact.
Something that drove that home to me more was when I got on the whole plastic pollution and education around plastic and waste, was the whole convenience mentality that you spoke of there. And it's humans have this desire just to make things go away. You know what I mean? With everything, everything they don't like, we've just got to make it go away. But we don't understand that away isn't really away. It's going somewhere where it's going to cause even more problems. And the whole thing, and that's something else you mentioned about having to go the extra mile, I guess, was that if I like using the word right relationship, if you're in right relationship to the process of your composting toilet, I find that the effort, even the word effort is not, you don't even need to use effort really. Changing the composting chamber is kind of a joy. You know what I mean? That might be a big step for some people to say, oh, how can it be a joy to get rid of your poo? You know what I mean? But it is, because you're dealing with it properly. And if you do it the way it's supposed to be done, it actually isn't a dirty, smelly job at all. It's actually, I find it a nice process every single time. I did it 2 days ago, and I'm like, wow, this is so good.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like you get to learn a lot as well, right? Of just how to compost. Like before doing this, I never really knew the proper way to do it. And even just having regular compost of, kitchen scraps and all of that, I was never sort of able to, I never dove into that deep enough. And then having to do that here on the land, creating compost and human manure, I'm like, whoa, I've learned so much. And again, I love that you talked about it being that right relationship, because that explains it in such a just a simple way, but also really powerful. And yeah, there's so much that we can do. Like even all those, there's so many micro things that we can do on an individual level, which then can be this knock-on effect on a collective, a community. Well, let's even go back a bit further. So the individual, the family, the community, and then you can kind of keep going bigger picture from there, and all of a sudden it could be the collective. So with your composting toilet, you mentioned before that you spoke to someone in the you bought it from somewhere in Brisbane, and that it was sort of recommended to you as a right size for the two of you. And for the Nature Loo 650, I'm wondering if you're able to give just a bit of a rundown of how it works and what that kind of looks like on a day-to-day or maybe a month-to-month basis for you guys. Even you mentioned it was a split system, and so for anyone that doesn't really know what that might entail, what that looks like.
A split system, I would just recommend to anyone, actually, even if you're only going to be in your tiny home part-time. And a split system basically means you've just got some of the system is above the floor of the tiny home and some is below the floor, as opposed to one of the smaller ones where everything is above the floor, like it's all enclosed in the toilet itself that's in the bathroom of your tiny home. But it usually means it's just a tiny little cassette, what they call a cassette, that everything goes into, and you need to empty that really, really often. As in, I don't know, I haven't seen one, but I would imagine it'd be 3 or 4 times a week, as opposed to a split system that you only need to deal with at most once a month, but every 6 to 8 weeks, we find, with ours. And so you have a big chamber. Well, let's rewind. You have 2 chambers, one which is called an in-service chamber, and that's the one that is currently being used, that everything is going into underneath your tiny home. And the other one is called the out of service, and that's the one that's already full that you have disconnected last time. And that one is ideally just sitting in the sun somewhere. And we call it's cooking or breaking down. It needs to be, as hot as possible. Ideally, you could have 3 or 4 out of service chambers as well. We were considering getting a couple more, because the longer it can sit and, break down in that chamber, the better. But we actually haven't had any problems with just having one out of service chamber. The split system is, above floor and below the floor, and then each chamber has a false bottom on it. So all fluids go through the false bottom and they drain out into whatever you have chosen to be where it drains out into. In our case, we have what you call an absorption pit, and it goes through a grease trap before it gets into the absorption pit. Some people choose reed beds and all kinds of other ways of dealing with it. We tried that previously and we found it didn't work for us, especially with the rainfall we get here in the Northern Rivers. All the fluids just go into an absorption pit, and they just harmlessly break down or go down into the soil, which is at least 1 meter below the surface. And so when the chamber is full, I'll disconnect it. Before we even go any further, I'd like to mention one of my favorite words is the microbiome. And if you don't know the word microbiome, look it up. It's the world of microscopic organisms. That is everything, bacteria, fungi, viruses, all of that, which is mostly, if not entirely, beneficial to humans, which is not what we've been led to believe. We have microbiome all over us, inside us. It's everywhere, all the time. And it is our friend. So you really need to understand that when you're dealing with your composting toilet, and it'll really, really help you. What I do with the already full chamber is I have an area near my tiny home that I do all of my composting, both, the food composting and the toilet composting. And I'll dig a hole, and the hole would normally be about 800 wide by about 400 across and about 400 down depth. And I'll leave a bit of loose earth at the bottom of the hole, and then I'll tip the entire contents. Sorry, let's rewind. I'll drain out the remaining fluid from the chamber first. I've learnt from that, because if what you're tipping into the hole is too wet, it takes a lot longer to actually break down properly. So I'll just drain it into, luckily we live in a foresty, very bushy area, so I'll just drain it down the hill somewhere where it's not going to smell and not impact anyone. So then I'll tip the contents, the solid contents, into that hole. And something that I've learned as well is to then even out the top of it, the surface, and then cover it with dry organic material. I'll just go and grab leaves, dry leaves. We have a lot of pine trees. Pine needles are amazing. I get as many pine needles as I can. And also you're transferring microbiome from another area into your composting area. And so the greater variety of microbiome you can have in your area, your composting area, is ideal, like as much variety. Mm-hmm. So by transferring all of that organic material from somewhere else onto the top of the pile of waste that you put there is fantastic. And then I'll cover that with soil. That would maybe be about 15 centimeters of soil, and don't pack it down too hard. Just pack it down a little bit because it needs to breathe. The microbiome is kind of like us. Most microorganisms need oxygen. So you need to leave it to be not too loose, but a bit loose so they can get oxygen and live and thrive just like we do. I'm lucky my local cafe uses a lot of eggs, and I get the egg cartons, and they're the ones that don't have the annoying stickers on the top, right? Because when you put egg cartons into your compost, the stickers, often plastic, or they've got stuff all over them, is not good for your compost. So I'd peel them off if it's one of the ones with stickers. If not, I just cover that entire little section with egg cartons. And once I've covered everything in the, say 15 centimeters of soil, so cover the entire area there with egg cartons, and then I'll put some green matting. I think they call it weed matting or something like that. That's not 100% necessary, but it's good just to keep everything down, and then line the outside of the weed matting with bricks just in case it gets windy and it won't all just blow away. So it's just to keep it there good and secure. And then I won't even go back there for, 6 to 12 months into that space. I'll just keep doing that in the space next to it, and then next to that. And then you'll have a nice big area of really beautiful fertile soil that you can grow things in. From the information I've read, from the Humanium Handbook, you shouldn't really grow anything in there for at least a year after, just to make sure. But it's quite amazing. I find it like just astounding. Like sometimes I've gone back to a spot where I've put, like the contents of the chamber only a few months ago, and I've kind of dug around in there to have a look, and it just looks like pure soil. I cannot see any evidence of human waste whatsoever, both smell or from sight. It's just incredible. Yeah. So maybe a year is they say a year just to be super safe, but you could probably grow stuff in it after 6 to 8 months. And lots of worms.
Yeah.
The worms brought so many worms in too.
Wow. That's how you know it's healthy soil. What about mushrooms? Do you get sometimes mushroom growth in there as well? Yeah.
everywhere, and that's where I guess the knowledge we've gained from doing syntropic farming,
Yeah.
which is just so it brings the whole microbiome into its entirety, is we use logs, and using logs to line your syntropic farming beds is things that promote mushrooms and fungi. And a lot of people go, oh, fungi, mushrooms. They're our friend, people. They are our friends. The more mushrooms and fungi above and below the soil, the better for everyone and everything.
Definitely. I love a few things that you said there. So the first one, I mean, we'll just talk about it now because you said it again, the microbiome. It's that reminder of our connection to nature because we have our individual gut microbiome that I mean, I've heard from many different teachers over the years that arguably we're more microbes than we are human cells, right? So there's that, and then you've got the microbes in the compost that's literally breaking everything down into that soil that can then be returned to the earth. And so it's like this nature and this reciprocity, this cycle that it's just this giving and receiving, giving and receiving. And then we've got the microbiome of the whole planet. And again, it's that right relationship you were talking about. And the other thing I love what you were sharing as well is with the composting material that you're using, because there's so many different things that you can use. And often what's talked about in the tiny space is using things like pine shavings or hemp, and people buying those things, which is obviously one, it's a bigger cost. Two, it might have to travel somewhere. So then there's the inputs of transportation and petrol and all of that, where you've actually, especially for living on a rural property, you've actually got things locally right on your land that you can use. And you're talking about the leaves, and then even helping out with, taking the egg cartons from the cafe. I use, when the landowner here gets on the ride-on mower and mows the grass, like I use a lot of dried grass. I use a combination of the different things and actually try different things just to see what works and maybe what's better and what's not, the best option. But there's so much that we have, just on the land. And again, it's that deeper connection to it. And you mentioned as well before, Anthony, about smell. So I would love to just talk a bit about that, because I feel like that's one of the top three composting toilet questions. People that have never used one of them before or have heard of the idea but don't really know much. And it's like, but doesn't it smell? Like, what about the smell if you're not going to flush it away somewhere and it's going to, so what would you say to that, and what's been your experience around that?
Do you mind if I just rewind for a bit and mention something, because
Yeah,
it's connected to what you've just asked me as well? It's
for sure, for sure.
it is to do with our paranoia about microbes, about bacteria and things that can harm us. And so with the empty chamber, the one that I've just tipped into into the earth and covered, that chamber is now empty, but it has the vestiges of everything still in it. And something which is really, really, this is super important. And so I have a hose. I will hose it out and get the larger pieces out, and I'll just tip it into the bush, which is totally fine. I will never, ever use any detergent or disinfectant or scrub it or do anything like that, because it's the opposite of what you want to do. What you're doing with that chamber is building up a beautiful microbiome within the chamber itself, which then helps when you then connect it back up again. You don't need to then create. It's like, I don't know if you've ever made kombucha and you've got the mother.
Yeah. Yes.
And so you
Yes. Yes.
create the mother, and then
Yeah.
so it feeds on itself, and then it gets bigger and more bountiful and more abundant, sort of thing. So when you've emptied out that chamber, just hose it out and get if there's any large bits still stuck there, just hose them off, but do not use any detergent, and especially don't use any disinfectant, because you're then killing the very thing that is your friend, that is part of this whole beautiful system. And when you mentioned interconnectedness and everything before, I love a term that was coined by a guy called Thich Nhat Hanh, and it was interbeingness. It goes
Yes.
another
Yes.
step further. It's like interbeing. It's just everything is here for each other, and it just recognizes that we're all beings, all in a part of one, I guess, oneness in a way.
Now for a quick break from the podcast. Question for you. Have you got a burning question about tiny house living? Here's my personal invitation to you to ask a question you might have been wondering when it comes to living in a tiny house or creating your dream tiny life. I'd love to feature your question on the show in an upcoming episode and share my answer, or even get another expert to answer if there's someone better suited in the same episode as well. To submit your question, head over to tinyhouseconversations.com/voicemail and leave me a 90-second or less voice message there. Okay, let's get back to the show.
So the whole smell thing, the first 6 months with having our composting toilet, we did have a few issues, and we did have a couple of times when we had some smell, and we had fruit flies. Like, we had a really bad fruit fly problem, which I heard is common. And again, we're so lucky. We have these experts up here in the Northern Rivers, and one guy who just has been all over this for like 2 decades, he came over and he said, basically, you don't have enough microbiome in your toilet yet, but that may or may not be the problem. What we had done was, we'd heard that you can throw food scraps or even coffee grounds into your composting toilet, and that may or may not be good for your composting toilet. Depends on where you live, because it's all got to do with the climate as well. So we were actually tipping coffee grinds in there, and then that attracted fruit flies. And we had, every time we'd open the lid, it'd be a swarm of fruit flies coming out. But we didn't put two and two together. And he said, it's the coffee grounds, probably. And we stopped with the coffee grounds, and the fruit flies stopped. Another thing he showed us to get rid of the fruit flies was, depending on your system, the reason why you don't have a smell in these split systems is because there's a fan inbuilt into a chimney, and the fan is a reverse fan. So it's sucking air out of your bathroom, down through the toilet, and up a pipe which goes up the side of the tiny home. And that is 24/7. That fan is going all the time. So if it stops, you are going to get a smell in your toilet, unless you've got, like, you can have a backup battery, which we have as well, and it kicks in if you suddenly, for some reason, you run out of solar power or something like that. Basically, it's always drawing the smell or the air from the bathroom down the toilet and out of a pipe on the outside. And that's like that all the time. It's like, even when you've been to the toilet, I don't know how into this you want to get, but often when you've been to the toilet and you've done a number two, it can be quite smelly in the toilet, in a normal toilet. That never is the case with a composting toilet. Yeah. It's always drawing the air down and out, sort of thing. There's a little section of that pipe where you can tip wine. If you drink wine, which we do, red wine or white wine, red wine works best apparently. You can have a little bit of red wine, which attracts fruit flies. So the fruit flies love red wine. They go in there, they have a party, and they die in the little red wine swimming pool. That guy advised us to do that as well. So basically, where we live, maybe where you or someone else lives, you can probably, you might be able to put coffee grounds and food scraps in, but the area where we live, it's far too humid and wet most of the time. So it doesn't break down quick enough. And then it causes the fruit flies to go down there and want to have a party. So we've never really had that problem again. And we've never had the smell problem, because that fan is just, whoever invented that or thought of that, it's so simple, but it's so effective. It's incredible.
Agreed. And I think the cover material helps too. I know for me, it's a combination of those two things. And I actually, a couple months ago, had a situation where, it's a long story which I won't go into, but something happened with my composting toilet here, which is actually a self-contained one, a little bit different to what you were describing before. But when I go on my next one, I will get a split system. But anyway, the fan stopped working. And that's the only time I've had a situation where you do start to smell it, and then you do start to get the flies coming around too. But when that was rectified and fixed, it's never been a problem. And you're right, when you use a regular toilet, I've definitely had experiences more where the smell hangs around there so much more. So I think it's again just that unknown and that perception. But when you actually start to use it, it's a different story. And I would love to go into, or actually, let's just back up for a moment because I think some people might ask about this, and this is something that you said very early on in the conversation. You talked about how uh, the liquids and your system setup goes into an absorption trench, and that's like what I have here, and it's also I've got for my grey water as well. So for you guys, is that something that you got a local plumber to do, or was that something that you were able to do yourself, or how did that work? Because I know some people ask that, like, what is an absorption trench even, and how do I even get that
Yeah,
happening?
yeah. There's even on our local council website, they acknowledge that people are going to do this kind of thing, and so they set out guidelines for digging, having a proper absorption pit, and you can have what you call a grease trap, or even a little, oh, what are those other things called that a lot of people in the country have on their home, like where all the sewage goes? I forgot
The
the
septic?
septic. Yeah, you can have a tiny little
Yeah,
septic there too, which it cost about
yeah.
3 or 4 grand. So we thought we might go down that road when we have the money to do it. But at the moment, it's working fine anyway. So everything, all of our what you call black water comes out of the composting toilet, and your grey water from everything else, you know, your kitchen sink and your shower and everywhere else, that all goes into one pipe, which then runs down. And we dug the trench, and we got some help, not from a plumber, but from a very knowledgeable friend. And he had a little digger as well, like a proper small little excavator. And so we run a pipe which then goes through into a grease trap, which you can buy at many hardware stores or even online. And then it comes out of the grease trap and then into an absorption pit or trench. And the trench is about 2, 3, 4. It's probably 5 meters long by about 1.5 meters wide, and it's about a bit more than 1 meter deep. So you need to dig that, and it's probably better to have a digger rather than dig it yourself because it's super fit. You know, it's going to take a while, and then you fill it half full of very, very like large gravel. They call it road base. Road base is really large gravel, like about an inch or an inch and a half, and then that gets covered in what they call geomatting, and then you cover that with soil, a lot of soil. So it's then maybe 30 to 40 centimeters of soil, and then we just have grass growing on top of that. So basically, the pipe runs along the gravel section, and it has the pipe itself. We cut holes in it everywhere, so that pipe is full of holes, and so everything that comes out of our tiny home, both the toilet and grey water, flows along that trench and just goes downwards. You know what I mean? So it's going to filter downwards. It's going to go through gravel and then down into the earth, which is already a meter deep. So you're never going to ever going to smell anything from there either, unless you had a landslide and the whole thing gets destroyed. It just works so well. We've never had a problem. When the floods came, I shouldn't say we've never had a problem. When the floods came, we did have a little problem because the grease trap got full of water as well. But we've now rectified that by digging a drain around the grease trap. So there's very little chance that flood water will go into the grease trap. But apart from that, it's fantastic. Another thing we do is, and we were advised this by a plumber, we have a tub in our kitchen sink. And so we do our washing up, and most of what with greasy stuff, fatty stuff, we're mostly vegetarian, but sometimes we might eat chicken or something with fat. And so we capture 90% of our washing up and we tip it out into the garden, just onto the grass or whatever. And we use chemical-free detergents and all that kind of thing. So they're very soft, and it has very, very little footprint on everything outside. So from the kitchen is where there's going to be a lot of grease going through and can cause blockages. So if you can limit that, which we do, you're not going to have any problems.
Yeah, an absorption trench seems to be one of the most recommended things to do for tiny house people, especially if you're, because when you're looking at septic systems and maybe if you don't own your land, and you're renting someone else's land, that then adds in the whole existing infrastructure, the council side of things as well. I've got an absorption trench, which sounds like a similar dimension to you. And I got a local plumber here to do it, and they brought the excavator as well, and they did it all, and it seems to be working really well. And something that I wanted to just go back to, because we have been talking a bit about microbes and the microbiome and fungi and all of that, is just to, I suppose, acknowledge there is this idea out there and this perception that we've been told, and you're probably familiar with this, is like the germ theory, right? Of everything needs to be sterilized and clean and, wiped down. And some people are just really afraid of all of that stuff. And it's kind of, they're a massive part of our immune system. And it's really about keeping all of that in balance and in harmony, so that our immune systems can do exactly what they're supposed to do. We can live in balance with the natural world around us. And I actually think that just with the whole sterilization of everything, that if I accidentally drop something on the floor that, I'm cooking or whatever, I'll still pick it up and eat it, because I'm like, it's the microbiome, like it's strengthening your immune system. Yeah. Or sharing with other people, just things like with your hands and stuff. It's like we're all actually sharing the microbiome, and it's a good thing because it is strengthening that immune system. I could say so much more about that, but then that'll just go down a different path. And so I wanted to also, maybe I know one of the answers to this, but you talked before about the coffee grounds and the food scraps and that inside the composting toilet. And I'm wondering, any other key lessons for you around using a composting toilet? I'm guessing maybe that's one of them, but anything else you can share?
Yeah, I mentioned to you in our emails that we were considering getting another one, and we probably will down the track a bit. And
yes,
this issue is really pertaining to me in particular, and it's really just a personal thing. So it's not like I'm recommending it to anyone else at all. It depends on your personal situation. I guess it's got a bit to do with my age, and I have a bit of a chronic back problem, which yoga has actually helped to rectify, but it's still there. And I have knee issues from too much sport when I was younger and all kinds of different things. And so the thing I found at my age and all of these different bodily issues is that chamber, when it's full, it has to be lifted. Like, it's really heavy when it's full. And so I have to lift it and carry it to a spot which is a good, like, probably 30, 40 meters from the tiny home. And it's also downhill, and that's not good for your knees. And there's a steep bit. And I thought, maybe get some kind of a trolley, but then will it work with the trolley? Who knows? And so we were considering getting one that you actually don't have to ever change and do all those things I was talking about earlier, which in one way would be a bit sad, because I kind of enjoy that process, but still it's bigger systems, and they do cost significantly more. I've checked them out. There's two main ones. One's called the Nature Loo, and the other one, I've forgotten the name of it, but it's got, the Nature Loo has got, if you imagine a pie cut into slices, I think it's got, let's say the pie has got 6 slices in it, and that thing that I'm calling a pie is the section that's underneath your tiny home. So basically, what comes down the chute from your toilet, you've got one of those 6 sections is open, and it goes into there. And when it's full, it's circular. So you just move it to the next one. And when that one's full, you move it to the next one. By the time you get around to the beginning one, you can actually slide it out, and it's so well composted. You could just tip it in the bush. You don't need to do anything else. And it's not big and heavy either. I'm finding that, I may not do it yet, might be a few years, but I'd say I'll probably end up moving to one of those as well. And so it's like you only ever have to do any kind of disposal once every 6 months at the most, probably more. And it's really just lifting it out and tipping it. You can dig a hole and bury it if you want to, but according to the information, you don't even need to do that. It's fine. If you live in a bushy area, it's safe just to tip it, under the trees or whatever. So, and the other composting toilet was a really big, really just a massive chamber underneath, which has different sections and baffles, and it slowly makes its way down to an area. And by the time it gets to that section, it's composted enough to, again, just get a spade and throw it away into the bush, sort of thing. But that you only have to do that apparently once a year. It eliminates that need to lift something super heavy. But apart from that, and the fact that once earlier I accidentally hit the chamber with a mattock when I was digging, and it's got a crack in it. The crack's getting bigger and bigger, and I've been using tape. So sooner or later, I'm going to have to change that chamber anyway.
That's funny. I hope it doesn't impact on the composting process. Like, I mean, you did say that it does need oxygen at the same time too. So hopefully you just keep out the flies and whatever with the sealing it with tape.
Yeah.
Whatever.
I used some pretty good tape, and it seemed okay. But
that's good.
Yeah, you can. Anyone who has an unlimited budget can look at all of these different things, and it's really what suits you and your specific situation and needs. Another thing that we've mentioned is that Kira and I both lead really busy lives. We volunteer at two local different places, an animal sanctuary and a community cafe, and we're just doing stuff all the time. If I didn't have such a busy life, I'd probably experiment with a reed bed rather than an absorption pit. So it's just what you have time in your personal situation to do and your inclinations, I guess.
Do you have any, if maybe you had to give one tip for someone who's looking into what composting toilet system could be right for them? Of course, there's many different contexts and all of that, but yeah, anything that you might be able to share?
I would actually say to have a reasonable knowledge of the microbiome has been really, really helpful to us. And that came through our passion for syntropic farming, and also Dr. Zach Bush, who I've mentioned already, who you might have heard of, but you can, if you haven't, you can link him. He's just amazing. An American, he was a doctor, he's still a doctor, I guess, but he has just done a whole foray into the whole microbiome, and he has a really, really good way of explaining things. He's got own YouTube and podcasts and website, and so getting as good a knowledge of the microbiome and an understanding of that and how it's beneficial to us. And that thing you said about how we're scared of bacteria, we're scared of viruses, and we're scared of this when they're actually our friend. That might be hard to grasp that, but they actually are our friend.
It's a symbiotic relationship, just going back to that right relationship with the planet that you talked about before. And yes, I love Dr. Zach Bush. I'll put a link in the show notes for anyone that wants to check him out more. There's some really good podcasts out there. And you mentioned before too about in terms of having to lift the really heavy chamber. And I think I mentioned to you in our email exchange offline that I was looking into the Nature Loo Alectura, which is, I think, their most recent model. And the premium version of that actually comes with, and you might have seen this, a trolley that is designed specifically for moving that chamber. And it is a bigger investment for sure, but I'll put a link in the show notes for anyone that might want to check something like that out too, because that seems to help solve that issue if you're someone that maybe either doesn't have the capacity to be able to move something like that, or if it just just makes things easier and prevents injury and things like that.
Yeah, if you're I guess an older person, a little bit less abled, you can still totally have a composting toilet. And if you can afford something like the Rotorloo or that other version where all you need to do is lift a little light thing out, or even have a friend help you with that lifting thing that only ever has to be done once or twice a year, it's totally doable. Yeah,
exactly. Now, Anthony, as we start to close out the conversation today, is there anything you feel like we haven't covered that might be important to share just around the conversation of composting toilets?
Growing up in the world as we do, we're part of, I guess, a story and different mythology and that kind of thing. It's the way we grasp our understanding of how to do this and how to do that. And a lot of it is useful, but a lot of it is definitely not useful either. And that's happened over, the course of human history. We've learned, and now we're learning that we actually haven't been living in right relationship to our planet for quite a long time. And it doesn't mean we have to go back to being caveman and cavewomen either, because we do have the technology. It's really just about having that right relationship and understanding that everything we do has a consequence and an impact. And by you, people out there choosing a tiny home or a composting toilet, you're, I guess, strengthening that field of a new story. We're stepping into a new story now, and there's a lot of people stepping into that new story and living in that new story. And the more of us that can do that, it enables it for others to come along and follow. However, the first people that do it, which let's say we are, and the previous 10 years and the next 10 to 20 years, it is always the hardest for us because we're just paving the way, you know, we're kind of like the pioneers. And so you got to have a sense of humor as well, and keep your humor, but know that you are doing something which is going to make it easier for future generations to be able to do.
Yeah, I love that. We all have a part to play, and sometimes it can feel, I feel like we might have said this in our previous episode before, but sometimes it can feel like, you know, who am I as one person? Like, am I actually going to make a difference? There's so many other people in this world. Like, it just seems like such a big task of moving towards planetary healing and deeper connection in all the ways. But actually, that little thing that you can do is what is the thing that you can control, and is the thing that can then contribute and be that domino and knock-on effect, like, as you say, for those future generations. So actually all those little micro choices that we make, like a composting toilet, saving water, not using as much, trying to get rid of as much plastic as possible, and all those other little decisions add up to big things over time. So I love that you brought that perspective in. And it's been really great to chat with you again, you know, and just hear about what you guys are up to. And I always feel like we could go into sort of the deeper philosophies of humanity and, you know, go so much deeper, but we'll have to say that maybe for another time.
Sure.
And really appreciate you coming back on the show and taking the time. I know that you're very busy. So thank you so much for being here again, Anthony.
You're most welcome, and thank you for doing what you do, because you are enabling a lot of people as well. So it's really important to have people like you, Lucy, to put this information out to the wide world. So, yeah, well done.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you saying that. And for everyone listening at home, we've talked a few times today about some different resources and links. And I do also want to mention, we talked about Anthony from Water Wally, and there's an episode on the podcast, I think it's episode 15. So I'll put that at tinyhouseconversations.com and everything else we talked about today. Thank you so much for being here as always, and stay tuned every Thursday for new episodes of the podcast. See you next time. Thanks again for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, you found it valuable, and you want to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So here are 3 ways that you can support the podcast. Number 1, if you have a friend or family member that you feel would benefit from hearing these conversations, feel free to share it with them, email them, text them, send them a telegram, do whatever you need to do to share it with them. Number 2, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the next episode is live. And number 3, if you head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next episode.